Hello, my name's Neil Fitzgerald. I'm going to give you a taste of some of the techniques I use to extract, analyze, transform, and load metadata during the Encompass to Digitool conversion at the State Library of Queensland. Then I'll go into more detail about the method I used to speed up a large number of global changes in Digitool. During the migration process, we firstly extracted the metadata XML from Encompass, then we analyzed the metadata and made corrections and changes in the Encompass staff client. Once this was done, we re-extracted the metadata. We transformed and enriched the metadata and then created the ingest files to load the metadata and the objects into Digitool. And finally, we customized the Digitool display XSL. Let's look at this in more detail. I used SQL Plus and PL/SQL to extract the metadata for each Encompass repository. The scripts used the Oracle XML extract functions, the getClobVal function, and the util file function set. A lot of the work in analyzing the Encompass XML was done using Saxon XSL 2.0 style sheets. I used the XSL for each group and the XSL keys elements and the regex match functions to create various data subsets, aggregates, and groupings. We produced data extracts in CSV format so our staff could analyze these as spreadsheets in Excel. Some of the CSV files were imported into Access databases, where mismatch queries were used to show references that were in one data set and not in another data set. Some spreadsheets guided manual or macro-driven updates in the Encompass staff client. Others were updated and corrected manually, and then merged back into the XML using XSL keys lookup functionality. This is how we added hyperlinks from the finding aids to the images of albums or manuscripts. Others were used in the design of the XSL code to transform the XML in the next enrichment phase. After all the Encompass updates were finalized, the metadata was re-extracted. It was then enriched and standardized using more XSL style sheets. In this stage, we standardized the metadata, we standardized copyright statements, we added geospatial coordinates, we eliminated some spelling and spacing variations, and grouped related images. We also added links to Primo, links to complex objects from member images, and enriched the linkages between the finding aids and the images. We also generated the Digitool ingest files using XSL style sheets. We used two transformers to load our records: the CSV transformer for photos, maps, artist books, and music scores, and the Mark XML with associated file streams transformer for finding aid EAD and audio and video. I added code to the Digitool metadata display XSL style sheets for Dublin Core, Mark, and EAD. For example, I changed element labels, rendered hyperlinks, and provided links back to Primo. We loaded our images first, and then the finding aids later. We added the finding aid identifier to the images metadata where we could before we loaded the images. After the finding aids were ingested, we used the global change service to replace the identifier with handle URLs of the finding aid in the image metadata. I'll describe this process in more detail. Some of the techniques might be useful to you. I've posted code details, including this presentation, to EL Commons CodeShare Wiki under State Library of Queensland Global Change Method. I used the Export Digital Entities job in Web Management to export digital entity XML for images and for finding aids. You might be interested in my transform XSL that takes the metadata XML out of the CData element so that these can be manipulated using XSL. If this job produced a large number of files, I gzip them using a shell script on the server before copying to my PC using FTP. On my PC, I unzipped the files. I used a Perl script to get a directory listing in XML format. Then I used XSL to merge the XML files together. I cross-referenced the image Dublin core and the finding aid digital entity XML to create a list of the finding aid identifiers and their corresponding handle URLs. There were about 800 distinct finding aids referenced by about 15,000 images. If you use this method to analyze your digital entity metadata, you need to be mindful of some odd digital behavior. Sometimes the metadata has a namespace declaration and sometimes not. So you need to use code like this to make sure that you can find elements in both cases. Normally you do global changes using the Metator Services menu. The first step is to retrieve the records from the Resource Discovery silo using the RET01 service. This extracts a list of digital object numbers, known as pids, for records containing the text that you want to change. Then you start a global change manage21 service to actually make the changes in the records. Because there were so many changes, I asked Xlibris for the equivalent server commands so I could automate the process in a server shell script. The RET01 process took about 10 minutes to scan our image set for each finding aid, so 800 times 10 minutes meant a couple of weeks of processing. Also in RET01, the string you want to change has to be in the first 20 characters of the element. The identifiers we wanted to change occurred after this. So I developed XSL stylesheets to replace the RET01 function. I started with the list of finding aid identifiers and the corresponding handle URLs. The XSL searched the exported image digital entity XML for each of the finding aid identifiers and output a file of PIDs of the records containing that identifier. So after this, there were 800 files of PIDs in all. This XSL method is more flexible than RET01 and a lot quicker. A subsequent XSL style sheet generated a shell script with a series of manage21 commands to perform the 800 global change processes, referencing the 800 generated PID files. The manage21 process is relatively fast, so this approach saved a lot of time. I hope you find these methods useful. I have done all sorts of analyses using the export digital entity management job for particular object subsets. As I've said, I've posted code details, including this presentation, to the EL Commons Code Share Wiki under State Library of Queensland Global Change Method. Thank you.